I always approach things from a scientific standpoint. It is the basis of my training as an academic. I say that because there is a lot that I would love to comment on in a more emotional or visceral way. But I'll be honest, just regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, I'm hesitant to engage those dynamics in today's political environment precisely because I don't sense emotion moving the needle. In fact, I often find that it's the emotional reactions that are somehow kind of overriding and consuming the more rational attempts that are being made to understand what's going on. And so, to be clear, I have very honest and personal opinions about our current president, for instance. But I try very hard not to let those taint my presentations precisely because the moment I do, the very people I need to hear me the most shut off. And so again, I tell people I think I'm a great professor or a great political speaker for no other reason that I have the ability to tick off both sides relatively quickly and easily. I take that as a compliment. When talking about identity, this is a topic that's extremely personal to me. Being half black and half white and growing up, born in 1970, I'm now coming to the point at the age of 55 where I can honestly begin to look back and see some really significant substantive changes in our society and culture during my lifetime. And not just from a textbooky type perspective, but knowing I lived it. So trying to explain to my students at Lincoln, for instance, that 3 years before I was born, it was illegal in 2/3 of the American states to have a biracial marriage. And that's, oh, well, at least you were born. No. 3 years, that culture that supported that sort of perspective doesn't go away. Those things linger. And so trying to get the current generation to understand some of the perspectives about race, gender, identity, sexuality, political leanings. I'll be perfectly frank with you. There's a part of me that looks at the American political landscape today, and I don't recognize things that I spent decades studying, starting with the Republican Party, to be perfectly frank. Just what I grew up with, I might not have liked everything Reagan did, but at least I understood why he was doing it, and might not have agreed with his goals, but at least I understood where he was trying to go. I kind of lost that compass today. So again, when I'm talking about identity in America, I tend to do it from a much more theoretical perspective, conceptually, because one of the things that I think sometimes, again, undermines our conversation in this point is the tendency of not just Americans, but human beings in general, to rely on stereotypes as their markers for identity. Even this relatively small group in this room, it would take me weeks to get to know each and every one of you, to be able to define you in my mind in an individual way. I got in an argument with a professor or early colleague of mine, being a very young African-American professor in a all-white department. We got into this conversation about stereotypes, and growing up the way I did, it was a 4-letter word. Yeah, there was no positive to a stereotype. And he, as a sociologist background in political science, he's like, listen, you might not like them, but they're actually essential to all human interaction. It is the base. Now, we could talk about how they're formed, how they're used, but in the end, if we didn't have those markers, if we didn't have at least these pre-established understandings of identity, we would all founder when it came to social engagement. It's been almost 30 years since he gave me that argument, and I tell you now, it still goes through my head. Because I almost have this kind of dual response when I find myself relying on a stereotype. Maybe somebody that's walking down the street that, oh man, that homeless guy, oh geez, he just got in a car. I guess he's not homeless. Ooh. You know what I mean? We all fall victim to it, even the best of us, so to speak. And so the reason I talk about stereotypes is because in many ways, I think they tend to symbolize what I would argue is one of the first and primary mistakes that is made relative to the idea of identity in America. So the question that I'd like to start this afternoon with is, how should the citizen identity be defined in America? Now, the reason why I think the identity of citizen is so important is because, for all intents and purposes, the identity of citizen acts as an umbrella over all of the other identities that potentially exist within American culture and society, whether we're talking about cultural or political or economic. all of those identities in one form or another fall under this concept of citizen. One of the arguments or one of the assumptions that you need to know that I make, identities are socially constructed. And I'll stop there for a moment. There is no such thing as an objective truth when it comes to identity. Every identity is the result of human interaction over time and a compromise over, okay, that's what we're going to call it. Quite literally, there was no concept of man and woman before two human beings with different genders started looking at each other and going, huh, you ain't me and I'm not you. What are we going to call each other? I mean that in the most literal sense. One of the analogies I use is, so we all look at that immediately identified as a table. What if I went over, put a pillow and a blanket on it and went to sleep and then called it a bed? Could you really argue against me? The moment we recognize that identities can be changed through compromise and interaction is the moment we have to accept none of them are set in stone. I'll put it another way. If identities were absolute truths, 3/4 of this presentation and most of the arguments in American society wouldn't exist. We wouldn't necessarily agree about the value, man, woman, Christian, Muslim, but no one would be arguing over what those things meant. But we do. And part of my argument today is going to be that not only do we argue over those things, but the arguments tend to be rather unique in the American context for a variety of reasons. So the other thing I should say is I know that generally speaking, you guys like to lay this out as kind of 40 minutes presentation and then 20 minutes. Man, I do not like to hear myself talk that long in a row. So please ask questions. I will stop mid-lecture and ask you questions. To me, I'm much more of a kind of Socratic method. I like the back and forth. I'll tell you what, I tell my students all the time, the best classes are the ones that I learn something too. And if I'm not engaging my students, then I'm cutting off my opportunity to learn. So please, if you got questions, comments, please feel free to jump in. So again, identities are socially constructed. So that means, how do we all get to the point where we're actually agreeing on an identity, like citizen? Identities are fixed through the application of power. So it's not just a group of individuals saying, okay, man, woman. It's the individuals within that group with the power to then say, as a man, this is what you'll get from society. As a woman, this is what you'll get. And then modern society creating laws to enforce those things. And again, you can start to think, I could roll out 20 different identities, and you would immediately begin to be able to see or identify certain legal structures that then define what their responsibilities, roles, and benefits are within our society. Children, taxpayer, married, divorced, retired. I could go on and on. Identity, if it didn't have that connection to power, if it was just a matter of, so who are you? And who am I? Oh, that's great. Pleasure to meet you. We all just kind of walk around meeting people, not meeting people. It wouldn't really have any significance on our lives. But I guarantee you, you are going to react differently if person one that you meet is a teacher and person two that you meet is a police officer. Because you already know there are differential identities, characteristics, and thus sources of power associated with that identity. Let me stop there for a second. Questions? Anything like, oh my God, do I have to sit the whole 50 minutes? No? Okay. Assumption number 2, identity politics is the process through which a society determines who gets what, when, and how. So again, this fixing of meaning, the creation of laws, customs, and norms that determine which identities get what from a society. The bottom line is, it tells us who gets what, when, and how within that society. That's the purpose of identity formation, and that's the basis of identity politics. It's that constant back and forth between the various identities within a society to figure out ultimately who's going to get what. Assumption number 3, identity politics in America is unique. This is my own theoretical argument, but I'll be honest with you, the more countries I've visited in my life, the more I'll stand by this statement. It is not that other societies don't have identity politics. They absolutely do. See women in Saudi Arabia over the last 20 years. See North African immigrants in Spain, Italy, and Greece. Again, they have identity politics. But my argument would be that identity politics within other countries tends to focus more on the conflict between the established identities rather than actually trying to define the identities themselves. The uniqueness of America is that we are literally arguing over certain identities, citizenship being one of the classic ones, that most other societies have already fixed long ago. Again, we can argue whether or not the Basques should have more power within the Spanish government or should they be independent. But no one's arguing what a Basque is or what a Spaniard is. And those arguments, again, this is my theoretical, as I told a gentleman earlier, I'm not here to tell anybody how to think. I'm just offering you my framework of how I analyze and assess things. You can take whatever pieces work for you. You come to the same conclusions that you had when you walked in, when you're leaving, all good. As long as I can argue that I gave you some additional tools to have a more nuanced understanding of not just where you are, but how you got there, then I've done my job. That's the way I look at it. So, again, from an American standpoint, my argument fundamentally is identity politics is different in this society precisely because we are still arguing over things that other societies have actually fixed long ago. Go ahead.
So I noticed that you said that identities are fixed through the application of power. It doesn't specifically say political power.
Oh, no.
So would we consider social power or force of use to matter as much? For example, like non-binary folks.
I would argue that prior to the development of the modern state system, so we're talking 17th century on, 18th century, and even then it absolutely wasn't uniform, and I can find kind of more traditional states today where it's still an issue. Ultimately, the power to fix those meanings tended to come from the singular leadership of that society. So I decree as the Holy Roman Emperor, boop, 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 and that's the law. It's still the same exact process. Only today we're using legislation, bills, and police officers for enforcement. Back then it was, are you going to defy the king? But the very notion, power, fixing meanings within a society, that's been, I would argue, it literally, we could go back in the time machine and sit in front of a cave somewhere and see a couple of cavemen arguing, I'm the hunter. I should be getting a bigger share of the deer. I'm serious, like very seriously. That concept, I would argue, is as proto to the human existence as the creation of fire. In fact, I bet you that was one of the first, hey, I'm the one. Keep messing with me. It'll be cold tomorrow night. You know, because that's just kind of human nature, at least my perspective. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah, please.
So when we talk about citizens, in my idea, the function of the government is to collect the taxes and then equitably and fairly and fiscally distribute them among all people in society, specifically those that need them. So based on that framework of essential duty of a government, with all this immigration reform and then pointing fingers about the Biden administration versus the Trump and everything, why can't we take that term citizen and kind of wipe out the ethnic diversity and the different lifestyles and say a citizen is somebody who pays into the system with, like you said, taxpayer, and then we start with that as the basis for the immigration reform. Do you think that's possible?
So it's you actually bring up a couple different points there. And so the first one I would argue, it is easier to consider that kind of legalistic understanding of the responsibilities of government and precisely those sorts of societies in which the idea of political identity is more firmly established. I think immediately of Scandinavian countries. There's a reason why you got countries like Norway with like 87% happiness index, because they're all the same. There is no issue with identity. Literally, the biggest identity issue Norway's had to deal with in the last 50 years was joining the EU. And even then, the only real question was whether or not this new identity was somehow going to dilute what it meant to be Norwegian. But it never impacted what they understood to be Norwegian. The second response I have to the point that you made, it's one of the paradoxes, I'll be perfectly frank, it's one of the paradoxes I would argue exists for American citizenship as an identity. We all tend to understand our roles with the government in that somewhat legalistic way. I'm paying my taxes, they should be providing me better education, better security, borders, whatever it is. But what if I argued that the paradox actually comes from the narrative that we use to establish the country? In fact, I would argue that the constitutional narrative, in many ways, was everything but legalistic, especially when you consider the impact of things like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. There was, again, this is one of those funny things, because it almost elicits simultaneously a pride and then a willingness to throw up your hands and get into a fight. Because in many ways, the vision that the Founding Fathers laid down is perhaps the most idealistic and pure vision of government you could possibly imagine. But again, it was based more on these understandings of what citizens would be able to do within that legalistic framework, not necessarily the boundaries of the framework itself. I know that's a long-winded professor type answer to your question, but so again, the bottom line here, the definition of a citizen is most contentious in America due to the way it was initially defined. So how was it initially defined? Early on, the concept of American citizenship really focused around this core question. What did it mean to be American in a world of empires, and who was excluded from that identity? So believe me, so I live the mantra, walk in another man's shoes. All right, so full disclosure, just being honest, I am an absolute closet nerd. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since I was about 6 years old. I love video games and role playing and working on my own fantasy book right now. I love what if it was like? I love that kind of open mind and so I literally have thought about making this slide. What were the thought processes of the first colonists? Literally, the rocking in the boat, they got another month and a half before they get to Plymouth. What are they thinking about with regards to what they left behind and what their thoughts and anticipations were about what was in front of them, especially relative to the concept of identity? Let me put it another way. The one thing they knew on that ride, and by they, yes, I'm talking everybody from the Plymouth all the way down to the Virginia colony. The one thing that they were considering relative to the idea of identity is what they were no longer, not what they were becoming or already thought themselves to be. This, to me, is an essential part of the story. None of the early Americans came here with a preconceived notion of what it would mean to be an American citizen. They all, in their own ways, began that journey by defining what they would no longer be relative to a citizen of the British Empire. You guys following so far? Radically different understanding of coming to the question of who am I? Okay, let me put this as direct as possible. I think the aggressiveness that exists within American culture today is because so much of our initial attempts as a national community to define ourselves was based solely on who we weren't. And as those thoughts progressed, we increasingly found ourselves in a position where we now had to defend our perspectives. And the first way we did it was by de-emphasizing the relative equality between the identity that we would eventually develop, American citizen, and all of the identities that we started by saying, that's not us. It wasn't just that, oh, I'm not British, or I'm no longer going to be part of the English church, or hell, I'm no longer European. It was then, man, that church, all they did was hold us down and they denied us our ability, so that church was bad. Oh man, those British aristocrats, they stopped my ability to advance my family lineage economically because I didn't have the right title. Oh, those damn elites. And so we developed this, I don't want to say hatred, even though it definitely comes across that way sometimes, but we don't have a whole lot of respect for all of the other identities, precisely because we had to kind of scratch that. Nope, that's another one off my list. I'm definitely not that. I'm definitely not that. And in convincing ourselves what we weren't, we had to come up with reasons why. And most of those reasons tend to be negative or pejorative. U.S. defines itself first and foremost against Europe. And these are themes. I know the language might have changed, but I'm telling you, the philosophy and the mindset is exactly the same today. Anti-monarchical. Sound familiar? We're literally doing no King's Days. 300 years later, and the same exact message is at the heart of what it means to be American. I don't know what American is, but I sure as hell know it's not a king. That's it. That's all I need to know. Next. 2, anti-aristocratic. America is having a really tough time with this one. Really tough time. Because, and again, this is just my own argument, throwing it out there. On the one hand, we hate elitism, just as a general society. And again, I personally believe it literally goes all the way back to your average middle class. It was very rare to have a landed elite coming over on those early trips. It actually, ironically, it wasn't until most of the land, or at least the initial settlement, was created by your middle class, your laborers, that you started to see the landed gentry come over and try and establish their own manors and farms. That's one of the reasons why you had the development of the Southern plantation culture and society. And from this perspective, we've always hated that elitism. But for us, it's a caveat. We don't like elitism that you didn't work for. But if you worked for it, well, Elon Musk, I guess you get all the power in the society you deserve. That's a dilemma for us. Because on the one hand, the ultimate, the billionaires, on the one hand, they represent the true completion of the American dream. But then at the same exact time, their behavior and power within the society brings up our hatred of aristocracies and elite power structures. The only thing that's kept the Elon Musks of the world, some of these really, just super, super rich, as a really functional and, quite frankly, revered part of American society by a lot of people, my argument is that they still, to a certain degree, represent a real possibility for the average American pursuing the American dream. If the average American no longer believed they would ever get to that level, no matter what they did, I think you'd see more social upheaval and backlash, right? But as long as, and what's really funny, because I grew up, and so this will ring true, I grew up, literally there was still this belief, okay, just give me the right six-pack and 2 weeks in the basement, and I will invent a better refrigerator. I don't need a college degree. I just need to be good in my hands. The Ace Hardware's open. I can get this done. Am I overly? I'm sorry, but when I grew up, there was this idea that if you were just innovative enough and you worked hard enough, you could literally discover or create something that would then move you up that path. Okay. Huh?
It did work to an extent. You're looking at Apple being formed in the garage. But Elon Musk didn't make himself. He inherited money before he made anything of himself. And people forget that.
Well, you see, you guys, you're nitpicking now. Next, you're going to tell me that Trump started his career with $3 million loan from his father. Come on.
Yeah, his father, yes. But that does beg the question, is the American dream obtainable for the average versus someone who has a little bit of a leg up?
So it's fun. I didn't intend it, but it's funny that we're down this road. So I moved. No, because I actually have directly engaged the question you just asked over the last 6 months, and it was kind of a shock to me. So I moved here in 2019, got a job as associate professor at Lincoln University, started teaching in the political science department. 21, got the first position as the interim dean of enrollment management, and off and running. I'm going to be honest with you. The last 5 to 7 years, I'm like, okay, I'm definitely on the American dream now. I am doing everything I'm supposed to. I'm working super hard. My salary's increased. My titles have increased. Man, I'm ready. Okay. So this past fall, me and the wife, son's getting ready to graduate from Rockbridge High up in Columbia. So we're thinking, okay, now's the time. Maybe I can now move down to Jeff City, be closer to the job. And I've actually made some decent inroads in the community, and I wouldn't mind being politically active, but I got to be in the community to do it. So now's the time. I looked for a house for exactly 6 weeks, and it hit me. I think I passed. I think I was the last generation in which the concept of that, okay, work hard, get this, do this, you'll reach this critical mass of salary, and then yes, the white picket fence, the 2.5, kids, the dog, it's all going to be right there for your taking. And I've done what I was supposed to do. There's no hope. No hope. And I say that seriously. I mean, I guess I could literally leverage myself to the hilt to have a little bread box. But to me, that's not the American dream. I'm supposed to be able to afford something that I find comfortable. And no. And it's not like, oh, I just missed it. The housing market, I'm talking to real estate agents, like, look, you literally are going to need to call me every Monday morning because the houses that come up are usually sold by Thursday or Friday. They don't even hit the listing. And oh yeah, be ready to offer 20% above market price because that's the only way they're going to look at your offer. Oh yeah, and we haven't even talked about down payment yet.
And the average person can buy a house in their 40s now.
And so
you're looking at 55.
And I mean, I listen. If you had told me I was going to be where I am now, financially, professionally, now, I would have been like, man, I'm going to be living high on the hog. I might even have an extra half kid. Who knows? And it just, and so it's funny you asked that question because I got to be honest with you. I've been rearranging my entire calculus after that experience. I'm probably not moving down to Jeff City anymore. Just because I am comfortable in the place I am. And so all of a sudden, what my American dream was is fundamentally altering. What I thought was going to be my twilight years, where I'd be, ironically, now I'm like, oh man, I guess I'll just take that mortgage payment and travel. So I'm already shifting into a whole nother gear. But the idea of that traditional American dream, that's gone for me. Please.
You mentioned like work hard. I think it's been tweaked a little bit because I've been hearing like, I can't make it with this job. We'll get a second job. It's like the bar keeps raising how hard you have.
And that's been happening for a while. Because I kind of started to experience that when I was in grad school. I mean, when I was in grad school, I was taking a full grad load, working full time, had 2 kids under the age of 5. And adjuncting. And it seemed like, okay, just do what you got to do. Like, it wasn't like I was, complaining and moaning my way through the day. It was just what I knew I had to do. But here's the difference. I still believed I'd get the payoff on the end. You know what I mean? There was a purpose for it. Looking back, I'm proud that I worked my way through it and did what I was supposed to do. But I'd be lying to you if I said you start me back at that square one again, that I'm going to do everything exactly the same, knowing what I know now. Probably not. And the other dynamic I would add real quick, my own opinion is that the part of the devolution, if you will, of the American dream has also been related to the pathways. So as you mentioned, as I talked about, I think work hard. That's the most direct path. The second one, which in my opinion has been attacked by levels of anti-intellectual in this country that I still don't fully understand, but the idea that we no longer consider education to be a path has really thrown me for a loop. And that both, to a certain degree, have been replaced by a belief that actually the 2 easiest and quickest ways to get to that dream, lawsuit or lottery. Maybe I'm being cynical here, but the number of people that don't work as hard as I think they maybe should, but they seem to have this perception in their head that, well, next week, my landlord's been doing this, I'm just going to sue him. Okay, if that's the path. And again, to me, it's part of this understanding of how has American citizenship changed. Because again, it's not just the identity. It is what we believe we will get from society as a result of that identity. Yeah.
I'd argue that currently the most popular method people expect to get them to a place like that would be social celebrity.
That's generational. Yeah, I say that, now that said, there are some individuals I've seen on there calling themselves influencers, and I'm just like, are you sure? Like, you look like you're sitting in the DMV right now. What are we doing? But even then, it's just, forgive me, it's a growing belief that achievement of whatever dream might be left, or however you're defining it, now has to begin with what is the lowest amount of effort I have to put in to start this journey. That's what throws me off. So the third, and this is going to make you guys really laugh, the U.S. defines itself against Republican virtue. Now, again, for those of you that might have studied history, or especially European history, Republicanism in Europe is a decidedly different concept, okay? It is not a party concept like it is in America. It is a governing concept. And Republicanism in the European context, especially, again, we're talking 16th, 17th, early 18th century, was much more exclusionary. That's one of the reasons why the American democratic experience really upset the apple cart so big, because the majority of democratic states were actually Republican in nature. And so the idea of representation and power within the system, it wasn't your aristocracies and your monarchies of the previous age, but it sure as heck wasn't for the people, we the people. There's a much more narrow understanding of how government interacted with elite structures, especially economic structures, to then create the rules and dynamics for the rest of society. Early belief in American exceptionalism, a new kind of nation with a moral mission. Is anybody in here familiar with the concept of American exceptionalism? A little bit? I know. For those, I'm trying not to bore those that were kind enough to come to my learning and retirement class. Some of this might be repeat, but at the same time, it offers different perspectives. So American exceptionalism, it is not just the belief that we're better. It is not even the belief that we're the best. It is the belief that we are wholly unique. There is no one else like us. And that uniqueness is born from, for many Americans, a truly religious source. God himself has ordained that we are who we are. And here's the great, the interesting part of that. How do I know? Because we are who we are. If I was wrong, how did we win World War II? How did we beat the Russians to space? And I could go on and on and on. American history, for many, clearly justifies our cultural belief that there is no one else like us. Go ahead.
So with recent events in Iran and with our government, do you think that that's going to change if it continues? Because it's the first time in my life that I've thought, well, we are not maybe the first time that really hit where we're not special.
Listen, and again, I've studied this stuff for most of my life, to be perfectly honest. And as I told my wife, listen, if you can get your average Canadian to turn and look into the camera and use a 4-letter word explaining Americans, you know you've gone into the next dimension. That's just not how they do it. I'm not saying they've always liked us, but Canadians, that's just not how they approach. The British, the for people not paying attention, little things that make a big signal. The British, French, and Italians recently told the United States Air Force that they could not fly military missions in their airspace on their way to hit Iran. That is a first in the history of NATO.
I was watching the space shuttle, the landing and everything yesterday, and I was so proud, and I was watching it, and it felt so American. And then it was over, and I turned the channel, and there was the news, and I was like, yeah, it was like it.
Well, even that.
We're taken back to we're the good guys, and
Perfect example. Like, I am sure there were some very significant Chinese scientists watching the Artemis mission who said, do they know that we actually put something on the moon last year? Like, they flew around it. We stopped. But hey, so that's part of that uniqueness, right? And to answer your question more directly, no, I don't think it's going to change too much, because here's the irony of our narrative. We might shove it down people's throats, but we're not always wrong. There are unique aspects to America that do not exist. We're the only country in the world that has the capability of satisfying all of our natural resources domestically. The only one. Relative to your comment in particular, the moment we start to get significant pushback, we'll go neo-isolationists in a heartbeat. We've done it before, we'll do it again. And we can. Why? We are what England always wished it could be, untouchable by our enemies. I don't care how much you dislike us, how much you want to get at us. Man, do you know how much Iran and North Korea right now are wishing they weren't 3, 4, 5,000 miles away? But they are. And that's why, in my mind, comments and actions like what we see in Canada are actually more of a problem than some of the other international responses and dynamics we're seeing. Citizenship is deliberately narrow. So what's really important, and this is perhaps something that's most overlooked in the current birthright citizenship debate. The early definition of citizenship in the United States, and when I say early, I am literally talking about founding in the first colonies all the way up to the 14th Amendment, end of the Civil War. Early conceptualizations of citizenship in the United States started with the state you lived in. The idea of national citizen identity was literally just a byproduct of the fact that the state you were a citizen of happened to be part of the United States. It absolutely was not the first concept of citizenship that Americans had at the time. You were Virginian first, then you were part of the United States. Even after the Constitution, after the Articles of Confederation, your citizenship was driven by your state location first. Questions so far? Go. Go. See, they're paying attention.
And this refers to the previous one, and you got that one. But my question would be, don't all countries believe that they're exceptional? You were talking about Norway, for example, a while ago. People are most content, happy. That's that's something that they could pride themselves on.
So
They were exceptional in that way.
Special. So, and again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head as a clear response. My first response, honestly, it's hard to continue to think of yourself as being a truly exceptional group after somebody took you over and occupied your country for 50 years. And that's happened to just about every other country in the world, including your advanced European states. There's no European, listen, despite the French's best efforts, the Germans will remind them very quick, you're not as special as you think you are. And then the Americans will turn and look at the Germans and go, you're right. But we're the only ones. We're the only ones that have never suffered a long-term occupation or invasion like that. And that changes your perspective on what uniqueness and exceptionalism truly is. Absolutely, but that's the narrative. If we weren't
Said the same thing.
blessed by God, we wouldn't have our geography.
Or tectonic shift plating.
And you know what? You can call it whatever you want. We call it exceptionalism.
But it goes back to identity, because you're speaking as part of the dominant culture. If you're a member of an indigenous nation, occupation has been over 500 years.
Listen, and that's a really important, I need to be clear. This is not me standing on a podium with my finger waving at the average American going, you're immoral, you're unethical, you're terrible people. No. I would be willing to bet that you take any other society or culture in the world, you give them the advantages that we have geographically, and they would end up in the same space. Okay, I'll give you a really poor analogy, but it's just because it's where I come from. I'm a diehard Yankees fan. It's hard for me not to be an arrogant bastard just because. I mean, I'm not a bad guy, but if you want to start talking baseball, get to me when you got 26 championships. Then we can talk. And, I mean, it's just this natural power. It's why does that mantra even exist? Power corrupts. You don't have to be a corrupt person you can have the best of intentions. But it's a rare individual that then gets that power and doesn't start to see themselves in an elevated position relative to the other identities that they might have even intended to use that power on behalf of.
You do realize the Yankees are buying their championship.
Yeah, we've heard that all the time. That's what the jealous people say. I want to get to this one part because I think it's really important for understanding our identity as citizens in this country. Our identity is not based on practice. It's based on a contextual statement of the moment. I am free. I am not necessarily acting freely. The concept of freedom as part of American citizenship is this kind of blanket statement that the expectation is it's the individual citizens that will define that box for themselves. You figure out what freedom means. All we're supposed to do is give you the box, the ability to operate in that space. That's one of the unique aspects of American society. And again, one of those great paradoxes. I think if you ask the average American, if you ask the average non-American, they would tell you that one of the greatest single aspects of being an American is freedom. I've actually gone on a limb and said to my students that the single most overlooked freedom in America, the one that's most cherished and least discussed, is the freedom to do nothing. Do you know how many democracies there are in which it's actually a crime not to vote? That's a responsibility as a citizen. It should be here. Is that what you said? That'd be antithetical to what we understand being American is. I mean, and so again, the point I'm trying to get to is from the beginning, and again, forgive me, I like analogies because they tend to take the big, but sometimes I come up with really wonky analogies, so I apologize ahead of time if this don't make sense. If most other societies are a glass of water, relative continuity from top to bottom, I tend to look at American society as soda water, a collection of bubbles. Yes, they're all in the same container, but they're all individualized to the point that it's almost not water anymore. It's a glass of bubbles, each of them technically independent. We wouldn't even look at them together if they weren't in the same vessel together. But we're sure as hell not as uniform as other societies might be. And to my point, I think, at least at the beginning, that's exactly how we wanted it. If anybody's ever studied early American history, there was more animosity between individual colonies than there was between the colonies as a whole in Britain. We have not liked each other from the beginning. We just always have been able to find an external group, the other, to bring our identity together enough to act as a common community. I'll be even more direct. American identity has always been at its strongest when we had an external enemy to kick the butt out of.